In one of the first podcasts I did, I talked about the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. But I neglected to mention that there's also a small series on video by National Geographic on the book, on the content of the book. And it's really good. And they used the phrase in there several times, the roots of inequality, which is what Jared Diamond, the guy that wrote the book, was originally looking for. Somebody had asked him at one point why he was a New Guinean, why New Guineans were basically so poor and white people were so rich. And Jared Diamond didn't really know the answer to that at the time. He thought it was a really good question and wondered how it came to be. The kind of historical answer has been, at least according to the Europeans, has been that it was a natural genetic superiority that allowed Europeans to essentially conquer the world. And they're talking about basically conquering the Americas, North and South America, Australia, New Guinea, Africa. Why wasn't it Europeans that were being conquered by Native Americans, for example? He wanted to know. So the first thing he did, which I thought was a really good move, is he said, well, let's start at the beginning. Let's start when everybody was equally rich. Let's put it that way. When everybody on Earth were equally actually poor comparatively. And that was about 13,000 years ago, when everybody on Earth, all the humans on Earth, were hunter-gatherers. Agriculture had not started yet, and we were all about equal. Then what happened? What happened was agriculture. So domesticated plants and animals. But this is the roots of inequality, is that all over the world, agriculture didn't start. It started in one place first and slowly spread. And it started in other places independently, but much later. And that gave the ones who started it and were benefiting by the ones who started it a huge head start over everybody else. So basically, the idea is that once you have civilization, once you have agriculture, then you don't have to move around. So hunter-gatherers have to move around a lot, because if you stay in the same spot, you hunt out all the animals that are in the area, and then you don't have anything to eat, so you have to move on. So the hunter-gatherers tend to be nomads. Almost all hunter-gatherers are nomadic people, unless you're in a very rich area, rich in game, rich in food, and if there's no other groups of people living anywhere nearby. If that's the case, then you don't have to roam around. But for most hunter-gatherer societies, they had to be nomadic. So, but once you have a storable source of food, like a grain, and the first two to be domesticated with barley and wheat, and they're both unique in that they can be stored for years, actually. There's not a lot of carbohydrates can't be stored like that. Like you couldn't do that with bananas, right? But these are seeds, and they're seeds that have evolved in an area that went through long droughts. So the seeds are adapted to just waiting it out and not going bad. So they're really good sources of food for storage. So once you have a source of starch that can be stored, and you have animals on the hoof that you can raise, feed, and then slaughter, then you have the beginning of a civilization. Then you have the basic foundation of a civilization. And once you have a civilization, once you are able to settle down and stay where you are, then all kinds of other side effects come along. Like, for example, you now can accumulate things. Hunter-gatherers cannot really be rich, especially because they're nomadic. And they don't have any domesticated animals. They have to carry everything. If they have to move to another area, they have to carry everything they own with them. So they can't own much. So that's a big advantage when you're able to settle down and have a dwelling and stay put. Then you can accumulate things. So automatically you start becoming richer, and you have stored food and more food security, which makes you richer. And because starches can be cooked, they can become mushy and fed to young infants. And because the mother doesn't have to carry the babies on these nomadic journeys, then people with agriculture can have babies more frequently, so their population rises, so they are better able to defend themselves. But probably the biggest advantage of a civilization is that it's such an efficient way to produce food, so much more efficient than hunting and gathering. As far as how much time and effort it takes to produce enough food to feed people, that you can start to get specialists. So you can start to get people that don't have to be directly involved in food production. And that means inventions and development. So then you can get tool making and tool specialists and better tools, and you can collect more tools and weapons because you don't have to carry them all around, right? So that it just starts snowballing. This wealth accumulation just starts snowballing. Well, the people that first domesticated both plants and animals were in the Middle East, and it wasn't because they were superior in some way. It was because those animals and plants were very easy to domesticate. There are not very many animals in the world that can be domesticated. Almost all animals have had some attempt to domesticate them, and it's a very unique combination of characteristics that allows an animal to be domesticated. And it turns out sheep and goats lived in the Middle East and had those characteristics, and so they were domesticated first. And same with wheat and barley. They had characteristics that plants need in order to be domesticated, and they were domesticated early. And they were really good choices. Some of the other plants and animals that have been domesticated since then were either more difficult or took longer. Like it took thousands of years for corn to be domesticated to the place where it is today. It's a very productive grain, but in its original form, it was not very productive at all. It was a tiny little, what we now have as a corn cob was this tiny little, 1 inch long or less little thing that wasn't much food, right? So it took thousands of years for that to be selectively chosen and reproduced to produce corn as we know it today. So these original agriculturalists got about a 4,000 year head start over everybody else in the world. That's huge. And because they were on the Eurasian continent, this technology or these plants and animals could also grow to the east and to the west of them on the same latitude. And that's a big deal also. Anything that was developed in the Americas or in Africa they're not nearly as broad east and west as they are north and south. So, and plants and animals have a harder time spreading north and south because the day length is different. So the whole Eurasian continent eventually had all these domesticated plants and animals, and therefore civilization and all that came with it, and a huge head start over the rest of the world. There are reasons why Europeans became the dominant factor rather than Asians. But that is the roots of the global inequality that we see today, is that original head start. And I might as well mention that one of the reasons why Europeans were able to conquer these places like New Guinea and the Americas and Africa is that they also brought diseases with them. Not only were they technologically advanced, but they had a lot of really deadly diseases with them that they themselves had coped with. There were places in Europe where a third of the people in a town died, or half the people in the town died. They went through multiple plagues. And of course, that killed off everybody that could not survive that disease. And so they had a population that was capable of withstanding those diseases. So, but then when they came into contact with other people, they had multiple diseases that they hit them with all at once. So instead of one plague, and then 200 years later, another plague, so the population could recover. The Native Americans, for example, were hit with 7 plagues all at once. Really, really weakened them and wiped out a lot of people, which made it easier for the Europeans to conquer. So all of that together created the roots of inequality that we see today. It didn't have anything to do with racial superiority, any difference in intelligence. It had to do with geography. But the world is changing. that initial head start is becoming less and less important every day. And according to Hans Rosling, in his book Factfulness, which I highly recommend, the world is becoming richer. More of the people in the world are becoming wealthier, and more people around the world are rising out of poverty. Let's do what we can to encourage that trend to continue. This is Adam Lee Kahn on the Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.